In the last 10 years of his life, Beethoven composed some of his most iconic works. This video touches on key themes from your reading and introduces the compositions from this period that we are considering more fully in other videos. We start with biographical context. The compositions of 1817 and beyond come after about 4 years of compositional hiatus. During this time, Beethoven was embroiled in a custody battle for his nephew Karl, depicted at the center of the screen. Karl was the only son of Beethoven's brother Caspar Karl and Johanna Reis van Beethoven, a woman who Beethoven liked to call, in a very derogatory sense, the Queen of the Night. Beethoven was obsessed with being Karl's adoptive father. Although preoccupied with his life and work, he did not fill the role very well. Things came to a climax when the 20-year-old attempted to commit suicide and asked to be taken to his mother's house. Eventually, Beethoven and his nephew reconciled. Beethoven's music of 1817 and beyond includes important works for piano, orchestra and chorus, and string quartet. More than ever before, Beethoven focused on one work at a time. First came the Opus 106 Piano Sonata, which has come to be called the Hammerklavier Sonata. Next, in March of 1819, Beethoven set about writing a grand mass for the installation of his pupil and patron, the Archduke Rudolph, as the Archbishop of Olomouc. When Rudolph's installation passed in March of 1820, without Beethoven having finished the mass, the composer returned to writing piano music. He finished the final 3 piano sonatas as well as a number of shorter piano pieces, including the 33 Diabelli variations. From there he returned to the Mass that he had begun for the Archduke, which became the Missa Solemnis. The first sketches for the Ninth Symphony appear already in 1818, but most of it was composed in 1823 and 1824, after Beethoven had completed the Missa Solemnis. After the first performance of the Missa Solemnis and Ninth Symphony in May 1824, Beethoven spent about a half-year apiece on each of his 5 string quartets. The music of Beethoven's late style is often characterized by the extremes within it. Beethoven had become increasingly interested in the music of Johann Sebastian Bach and George Friedrich Handel, and in even earlier imitative polyphony. At the same time, Beethoven's harmonies break more and more the rules. Learned fugues and canons frequent the late works and are sometimes set next to short, playful, perhaps even intentionally naive pieces. These styles, as well as the texts that Beethoven chose to set, range from the serious to the comic. We should remember that the Ode to Joy and its themes of universal human kinship and God's embracing of all of humanity that Beethoven selected for the Ninth Symphony had been likely accompanied by general merrymaking and strong drink in the Masonic circles in which it was first circulated in the 1780s. Another way to characterize the music written by Beethoven in these days is to remark on its embracing both of sacred styles such as church polyphony and of the then popular marches, dances, and military music. One might also evoke the dualism of the beautiful and the sublime, qualities much looked for in art of the 18th and 19th centuries. Beethoven composed most of his late piano music after having received a 6-octave triple-strung piano from Thomas Broadwood's famous English company. The Broadwood piano had stiffer action than Beethoven's older Erard piano and a somewhat more robust sound. Remarks are often made about the clarity of its bass and the almost metallic chiming treble. Beethoven's own Broadwood would end up in the hands of Franz Liszt, who would then donate it to the Hungarian National Museum. The Broadwood on your screen is of the same model as that presented to Beethoven and is owned by the Beethoven House Bonn. In the background of this photograph, you can see string instruments that were owned by Beethoven. To the upper right of your screen is a picture of the young Archduke Rudolph, Beethoven's pupil and patron and the dedicatee of the Hammerklavier Sonata. To the lower right, you see the title page for the Diabelli Variations, another important late piano work by Beethoven that was published in Vienna in 1823. Like the Hammerklavier Sonata, the Missa Solemnis and Ninth Symphony are works of enormous significance and length. 3 movements from the Missa Solemnis, along with the entire Ninth Symphony, were given their first Viennese performance in May of 1824 at the Kärntner Tor Theatre. Both were received with enthusiasm, although some criticized them for their length and juxtaposition of the worldly and the spiritual. Beethoven's final works consist of 5 string quartets, the first 3 of which were commissioned by the music-loving Prince Galitzin. These quartets epitomize the synthesis of musical styles pointed to at the beginning of this video. According to the violinist Karl Holz, who was a member of the quartet with which Beethoven worked, the composer reflected in connection to these compositions that art demands of us that we do not stand still. You will find here a new kind of voice leading, and as to imagination, it will, God willing, be less lacking than ever before. Indeed, the five quartets contain some of Beethoven's most challenging music. They were perceived as more strange than influential until about 50 years after Beethoven's death. It is with Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata, Missa Solemnis, Ninth Symphony, and the late string quartets that we conclude our survey of Beethoven's music. Make sure that you study each of these works before moving on to the next module.